This world has a problem. The world is becoming dirtier and warmer, and we can't stop it. This is something we have been told for years. Greenhouse gas emissions are up, and it is causing a steady increase in the temperature of the planet, but it's also leading to early deaths. The Institution for Transportation Development Policy completed a study in 2014 where they tested a high shift scenario. Governments require the strongest vehicle pollution controls. Right now, there's an estimated 3.2 million deaths a year attributed to poor air quality. In this high shift scenario, governments significantly increased rail and clean bus transport, especially bus rapid transit, and helped urban areas provide infrastructure to ensure safe walking, bicycling, and other active forms of transportation. The projections also included moving investments away from road construction, parking garages, and other ways that encourage car ownership. Under this high shift scenario, not only would CO2 emissions plummet, but the net financial impact of this shift would be enormous. Plus, an estimated 1.4 million early deaths could be avoided annually by 2050, according to the International Council on Clean Transportation. In May of 2019, a study came out by two Australian scientists, David Spratt and Ian Dunlop. They said that by 2050, the human race could face a near to mid-term extinction level threat. The rise in temperatures will increase the rise in sea level, cutting off the Amazon rainforest, one of the world's largest carbon emissions offsets. This leads to an even worse planet as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases. According to National Geographic, the rise in global temperatures is also leading to worse natural disasters. The deputy director quotes, "Extreme weather events are costing more and more. The number of billion-dollar weather disasters is expected to rise." The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says the average annual cost of a year for natural disasters in the last 6 years has risen from $5 million to $10 million. So the question is, do you want to live? The EPA, or the United States Environmental Protection Agency, collected a bunch of data globally and concluded that the top 4 emissions of carbon globally are 1. Electricity and heat production, 2. Agricultural, 3. Industry, 4. Transportation. So what if we were able to decrease one or more of those numbers? That would mean giving us more time to figure out another solution. There are 2 main modes of transportation: active transportation and passive transportation. Passive transportation is what most people think of. It is the cars, the buses, the train, anything that uses wheels and gas to move you. Active transportation is the one that uses your own body. Examples include walking, biking, etc. To explain any of these alternatives, we have to look at the 2 general categories of vehicle emissions: direct emissions and life cycle emissions. The Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy defines them as the following. Direct emissions are emitted through a tailpipe, through the evaporation from fuel system, and during the fueling process. Direct emissions can include smog-forming pollutants and greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide. Life cycle emissions include all emissions related to the fuel and vehicle production, processing, distribution, use, and recycling/disposal. There are ways we can use passive transportation as transportation and still reduce carbon emissions. It would be the use of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles and hybrids produce little to no direct emissions, which is what we want. The exact amount of life cycle emissions depends on many factors, including where you get your electricity. However, they still produce fewer life emissions than regular gas vehicles. According to a study done in the UK and Scotland in 2020, if all vehicles would switch to electric, there would be a 12% decrease in the carbon's emissions. Another passive transportation method would be the use of public transportation, including buses and trains, especially if the buses and trains ran on electricity. This would decrease the number of people on the road and the amount of carbon dioxide emitted. In studies taken in American cities, if only 1 in 10 Americans used public transportation regularly, our country's reliance on foreign oil would drop by more than 40%. So passive transportation is one option, but what about active transportation? Even better are the modes of active transportation, i.e. biking and walking. Biking still has its drawbacks. Even though it is very little, creating a bike takes steel, meaning it does have a life cycle emission. But it is so small compared to any car, and after that, it takes no carbon. According to the Institute of Transportation and Development Policy, in the US and Canada, cycling only accounts for about 1% of non-recreational trips. The Institute came up with a scenario that we could reduce the carbon emissions in urban cities by 11%. But to do that, we would have to, in the next 30 years, change the 1% cycling to 14%. A nonprofit organization, Urban Pathways, did a study in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Between the years 2000 and 2014, Buenos Aires reported that they had a 17% increase in greenhouse gas emissions. They were producing 4.47 trillion metric tons of greenhouse gases. So they came up with the Climate Change Action Plan, a plan to reduce emissions by 2020 by a total of 1.46 trillion tons. They gathered that the transportation sector accounted for 28% of the greenhouse gas emissions. From 28%, 97% are produced by road transportation and 3% by trains and subways. According to the measures that Buenos Aires has been implementing since 2010 are the extensions of the public transportation system, the improvement and extension of the subway system with 19 new stations, and the construction of 140 kilometers of additional bike lanes, and the expansion of the bike sharing system with 400 new stations and 6,000 bicycles. These actions will generate a greenhouse gas emission reduction of 400,064 tons of CO2 in 2020. Walking has no life cycle emissions or direct emissions, perhaps the best alternative to a car. Walking can increase your health even just by walking for 30 minutes a day. One study found that if Atlanta, Georgia had the same level of mixed-use mass transportation and pedestrian amenities as Boston, Massachusetts, the risk of obesity for inhabitants would be reduced by 17%. These kinds of health benefits can lower insurance costs for employers and create a happier, more engaged workforce. But there is an issue with walking and with biking. It can only really be utilized in urban situations. It can be done in rural areas, but it takes a lot of time to get from one place to another. So what do we do in rural areas? One way to do this would be to make it easier for bikes. Biking on rural roads can be very dangerous and difficult depending on the state of the road, but this can be solved by building bike lanes and paths through tough terrain or busy intersections. Another point is, how do we make urban areas better for walkers and cyclists? It is important since it is easier in cities to use mass transportation and active transportation, but the best way is to encourage people to use active and mass transportation systems more than cars. Create an incentive for people in cities to take the advantage of mass transportation and the efficiency of walking. Create spaces and workplaces to store bikes. And many cities are already engaging on these sorts of tactics, including Boston and Buenos Aires. In the end, there's only one simple solution to the problem that faces us: global warming, the dirty air, and the health of the people we love. And that is to take care of the world that we live in.